there's an opportunity for all of us and for local peace builders to double down on their work also. So stepping back, I just want to focus on what sustaining peace means and the UN's focus on prevention. Now, many of you might be familiar with the joint study undertaken by the UN and World Bank on prevention called Pathways to Peace. This highlighted the changing nature of violent conflict, the fact that it's much more protracted with many more complex drivers, as I know we're going to discuss this morning, and more countries experienced violent conflict in 2016 than at any time in nearly 3 decades. And what this really made clear is that the costs of responding to crisis and not investing in prevention in a coherent manner have really become unsustainably high. It cited some 233 billion in terms of the costs over 10 years for our work done on peacekeeping, humanitarian response, and in donor refugee costs. And what we also know is that development and peace are critically interlinked. And Agenda 2030 is a paramount goal of the UN in support of member states, but it's also the best defense against violent conflict. But sometimes this means also rethinking the way that we do development. And over the past years, we've made significant progress in the way we approach peace building, sustaining peace in this much more coherent manner. And this means working better together across different areas of what we're all engaged in. What it means in practice, for example, is analysing and addressing real and potential drivers of instability. It means thinking about inequality, about poverty, climate change, land and resource competition, corruption and transnational crime and drugs. It means leveraging our strength in cooperation with host governments and the people they serve. And it means understanding that investment in service delivery and sustainable development and social cohesion are also investments in peace. So some examples of the way that we've tried to strengthen this coherence has been the recent reforms to the UN Peace and Security Pillar, driving the UN's increasingly holistic approach to peace building and sustaining peace. And one example of that is the office that I'm in the Peace Building Support Office, becoming part of this bigger integrated Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. For example, this is driving more coherent regional strategies and working together with peace operations. We're also seeing much better cooperation with the UN development system and their work on prevention. And I think there's other UN system colleagues on the line that can speak to this better than I, but the way that accountable leadership and capacities in the development system, the work that the UN country teams are doing on prevention is absolutely critical to this. We see, for example, the new UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework using capacities such as peace and development advisors to really bridge that work between peace and development and focus on growing national capacities, and other examples such as the new climate security mechanism. And in fact, Colombia is one excellent example of a non-integrated special political mission with a mandate focused on verification and then a UN country team supporting broader peace building activities, including with the support of the UN Peacebuilding Fund. Another tool that we have available to us is, of course, in the realm of intergovernmental bodies, the work of the Peacebuilding Commission, and this continues to expand. In fact, there was a meeting under the chairpersonship of Colombia earlier this year, focused on Colombia and financing for peace building. And partnerships are also a key part of building and sustaining peace. We need a broadly inclusive approach, including working with the private sector and civil society, women and youth organizations, and certainly the discussion that we have today, couldn't illustrate the importance of this better. The role of regional and sub-regional organizations is also critical. I just want to take a moment to talk about the financing aspect. And one of the big pushes of the 2016 resolutions was the need for adequate and sustainable financing for peace building activities. And one tool that we have to support in that is the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. Between 2017 and 2019, the Peacebuilding Fund approved some 531 million in projects for 51 countries. It's currently in the process of agreeing its 2020 to 2024 investment plan. And among other things, it's going to address challenges in cross-border regions, including those exacerbated by climate change. This could be particularly relevant to the Americas. as well as continuing its work on inclusive approaches to peace building. And one example of that is its annual call to support women and youth empowerment, which also is one of the very few mechanisms in the UN system that provides direct funding to civil society organizations. I think it was up to some 37 million last year. The Peacebuilding Fund directs 83% of its investments to supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. So, I mean, this in itself illustrates again this close connection between the work that we're doing in sustainable development and supporting peace, investments in peace more broadly. And just in a minute I have left, just to highlight some of the work that the Peacebuilding Fund is supporting in Latin America. It's invested more than 85 million in the region over the last 7 years. There's examples across Bolivia, Colombia, El Salvador, and Guatemala. It's supporting justice initiatives. Haiti was declared eligible for the fund in 2019, following the closure of the peacekeeping mission. I think there's some 11 million at the moment promised to focus on strengthening access to justice for women and children. Honduras, another example. The fund supporting regional cooperation between El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and a cross-border initiative between Colombia and Ecuador. I'll just end on the note that perhaps the area, and this was articulated in the Secretary General's report in 2019, that we need to make the most progress is in coherence on financing. And this means not just bringing in more money to be focused on peace building, but really utilizing the work that we do in development and at times in humanitarian response and with human rights cutting across all we do to be able to contribute to peace building as well for a much more coherent approach, living up to the Secretary General's commitment on prevention. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for bringing a very valuable point around the financing. And we know, especially in the New York space, how much discussion there is around, I guess, financing being one of the challenges. So I would encourage some of us, some of the experts on the call today to maybe later provide some feedback from their perspective. But for now, I want to pass it to Mirna from UNDP office in Panama to speak a little bit more about the work of UNDP in the region from more of a regional perspective and share maybe a little bit more on Peace and Development Advisors Program, the joint program between GPPA and PBS and UNDP. Mirna, if you can unmute yourself and let us know if you can hear us.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I can hear all of you. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Yesterday when I was with a Skype meeting with the camera, there was not a good connection. So it's why now I'm if we don't have a good connection, I'm going to take off the camera, okay? Well, as you have introduced Mirna. Can you hear me?
Mirna, maybe you can try without your camera, if that will make your internet a little bit faster, because you're freezing a little bit.
Okay, now can you hear me better?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I am talking from Bolivia these days. I'm the specialist in conflict prevention and dialogue in the regional hub for Latin American and the Caribbean. And my presentation has 2 moments. The first pretends to respond for the let me see. The first one is going to show how we are working in the region, And the second part would be a particular focus on the role of the peace and development advisor in the region. First of all, I want to highlight that in 2019, the Latin American and Caribbean region experiences a resurgence of conflict systems manifested in mass social mobilization and protests leading to violence episodes. These conflict systems are expressing the fight for political power, especially election, and also the latent inequalities, lack of inclusion, non-participation of citizenship, closure of civic space in many countries of the regions like Chile, Ecuador, Honduras, Panama, Bolivia, also in Peru and other countries. And they know the role of the young people who had taken the leadership in many of the protests. It is one sense that we identify. The second one is that we want to emphasize two moments. One is before 2019 and the other is after 2020. The new dimensions that COVID-19 brings are to precarious political and social cohesion processes in Latin America and the Caribbean. This current pandemic is foremost a health crisis with social and economic consequences, but also it presents an opportunity as it had generated political cohesion in countries like Paraguay, Panama, Bolivia, for example, where different and conflicting political forces have joined forces publicly to face this threat in a region with high levels of inequality and political polarizations. Also, I want to mention the relationship between the pandemic with fake news and disinformation. Is that we call infodemic as source to conflict and violence, including lack of trust and legitimacy on the state to respond to this pandemic. Also note the relevance to redefine the actual social contract. It's a special point for us because we can see that this moment open to redefine the actual social contract. In this regard, note that in the peace-building architecture, UNDP has development methodologies in the regions like the dialogue, scenario analysis, and early warning system. These are tools that we use these past years, and also we are looking to restrain the development of these tools. In the current context, we must emphasize the need to renew spaces for dialogue in and post-crisis, as well as develop innovative and up-to-date early warning and response system to this new conflictivity dynamic with COVID-19. Also note the need to incorporate renewed analysis of prospective scenarios, not only in the political area. It must add the economical and social issues to prepare short, medium, and long-term strategies. This is one view of what we are looking the new scenario in Latin America and the Caribbean in those moments, before and after 2020. Just to emphasize some points about the role of the DPA. We see that they contribute in a deeper development, like a prevention approach and strategy. Role of development and integrated solution for prevention is fundamental. This is especially the case when supporting prevention through stronger and more resilient institutions in country. Need to promote risk-informed analysis and address long-standing grievances, root causes of conflict, embedded in capacities within institutions, people and processes and works across the conflict cycle. Also, a structural solution requires working with governments, national and also local governments, but also beyond to include now civil society. Also, the balance between reporting to the member states on what has been done so far with pushing the boundaries of prevention and peace-building thinking. The contribution of UNDP to system coherence through UNDP's joint programs on peace and development advisors, climate security mechanisms, global focal point, UN project on transition, core government function and prevention of violent extremism and humanitarian development peace nexus. I must add that the national ownership and leadership being paramount, peace building should be about internal nationally and owned processes where we support when it's required or when requested. It's so important to recognize that sustained peace resolution did not provide a framework for capturing impacts and systematic changes. And when we are talking about funding, the funding financing is critical now. And PBF has done well, but all agencies are also implementing this funding and mobilizing their own resources for peace building in countries. It's important to ensure this finding and this financing. I think that it's a resume of the points that I want to emphasize in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirna. And I think one of the really important points that we are and should be thinking about, I guess, ahead of the 2020 review of the UN peacebuilding architecture is that specific mechanism or the framework that captures and provides the opportunity for us to analyze how we are doing on sustaining peace in a little bit of a consolidated manner, and maybe also region or context specific manner as well. So at this point, I would like to see if anyone want to add really quick reflections on the two presentations that we've heard so far from the members of the UN family. If you do have any quick points, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. Christian? Christian, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I have no further comment. Very agree with what has been said so far.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to say something?
Yeah, to thank both Chelsea and Mirna for your excellent presentations. Chelsea, since we're examining the peacebuilding architecture and before we start putting our ideas forward in the form of an discussion that we're having alongside this webinar, could you tell us about just in recent years the evolution of it has different names, but I think you call it generically a peacebuilding strategic framework, how that has evolved and maybe become tailored to the needs of countries that are on the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission, addressing these drivers of conflict that you referred to, And then secondly, I understand an evolution that many people have seen as promising is working regionally, like in the Sahel, and did I hear the Great Lakes region? Given that our own discussions are about the Americas region, working with the OAS, working with other sub-regional partners, any lessons from elsewhere on the PBC agenda that we can learn from for the Americas region?
Chelsea, do you want to quickly respond?
Sure. So a number of ways of answering your first question about how we look at peacebuilding strategic frameworks or peacebuilding priorities. I think one of the big results from the repositioning of the UN development system and also being able to have a more coherent approach across the peace and security pillar is really seeing UN sustainable development cooperation frameworks as the place where the UN centers its support around national priorities. So one of the big pushes in earlier Secretary General's reports was to have peacebuilding priorities articulated in national development plans. And that's become a focus in the Peacebuilding Commission as well. Now, of course, countries have to want to use the Peacebuilding Commission as a platform to be able to articulate their national priorities and to be able to garner international support. And we've seen that happening in a number of cases. So sorry to draw an example outside of the region, but I work closely on Liberia, and I think that's a good illustration of that. The Peacebuilding Commission was able to accompany work done around a national peacebuilding plan, but that then became integrated into the national development plan of the country, and that was actually launched in New York in the Peacebuilding Commission and became a bigger discussion about development and peacebuilding priorities together. And in turn, those national priorities have been incorporated into the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework so that the UN can organize itself around what the nationally articulated priorities are. So I think we're moving away from something where we have separate peace plans, separate development plans, etc., and trying to see that as much more of a coherent picture. And I think that's a sort of longer term vision in terms of more integrated approach to prevention. And then your question about how we see regional work. I think a good example of this has been conversations around the Sahel and being able to have a conversation that in many ways is about a lot of the development needs of the Sahel, but seeing how they are also conflict drivers, talking about issues around social inclusion, around inequalities, being able to have broader conversations that are facilitated that result in a more holistic approach to regional issues. I think structurally, in terms of the way the new regional divisions that sit between DPO and DPPA, we're already seeing evidence of being able to have a much more holistic approach to the way you approach settings that might move from a peacekeeping or special political mission to a regular UN country team focus. And something we've been working on a lot together with DCO and development system colleagues is the way the peace and security pillar can support common country analysis and the development of the sustainable development framework. And I think there's been a lot of progress there. There's also a lot of work being done, as I mentioned, around leadership and capacities and being able to support well with regional presences as well. I don't know if other colleagues in UNDP and regional office might be able to talk about how that is happening more at a Latin American level.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Mirna, do you have any quick points of reflection before we'll pass it forward?
Well, in this case, I'm going to share with Emmanuel. Emmanuel is also connected, so he's going to take the word. Emmanuel.
Hello. Hello, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so hi, Emanuele Sapienza here. I work with Mirna in the Panama Regional Hub on number of governance issues, mainly political participation and how this relates to issues of social cohesion and sustaining peace. On a couple of themes that have emerged in the conversation, And I've just sent a message in the chat on this as well. I wonder if it might be of interest, perhaps for me to share briefly a couple of reflections emerging from a piece of research that UNDP has just started on perceptions of democracy, perception of politics, and how they might be playing out. Some of the more recent trends into the new era, or in the new phase that we are getting into. So as Mirna mentioned, obviously, and others as well, there is definitely a shift in expectations regarding the social contract across the region. And what we have done was to dig fairly deep into data from Latino Barometro and other sources of public opinion polling to see what have been the most relevant trends and what are some of the root causes. There's a lot to unpack here, but just a couple of thoughts that I think could be relevant to this conversation. Two things. First, satisfaction with the functioning of the political system has never been very high, and there is data for the last 20 years in Latin America. Has never been terribly high in the region. It's been kind of fluctuating between 30 to 50% of the population that think that the political system is working well, but in the last year, it has reached its lowest point ever at 25%. That means 1 person in 4 would describe the political system as working reasonably well. At the same time, 79% of respondents across the region say that their countries are being governed in the interest of a powerful few, as opposed to the common good. Now, what we see is evidence that this dissatisfaction with the functioning of the political system is starting to spill over onto support for democracy as a form of government. Still, a majority of people would describe democracy as the best form of governance under all circumstances. But again, that support has been softening, and it has reached its lowest point, which is just above 50% in the last 20 years. Now, we have tried to look into some of the causes of this, and again, there is a lot to unpack, but perhaps just one thing is perceptions of corruption matter. Perception of economic performance matter. Now, in terms of what drives then in turn perceptions of economic performance, what is very interesting is that if you look at the traditional macroeconomic indicators like GDP, employment, unemployment rates, as a matter of fact, even inequality as measured by the Gini index, these are not very good predictors of perception of economic performance. Commodity prices are a bit more. But the best predictor of perceptions about economic performance are perceptions of economic inequality, which is not the same as what the Gini index says. So I think that speaks volume to some of what has been happening in the last couple of years, has been brewing for a much longer time. Partly related to that is that while economic performance matters, what we see is that the integrity of democratic institutions matters as well. So what we see is that countries that have strong democratic institutions and processes that people tend to trust also become more resilient. The political regimes in these countries are more resilient to the ups and downs of the economy. So it's possible, it's very possible, maybe probable, that a lot of this will be changing as we move into this new phase that is just starting to unfold. But there is at least a couple of questions that I think are very relevant to the discussion we're having now, which are, in light of this emerging narrative that perhaps less than democratic systems are more effective in dealing with the type of emergencies public health emergencies or other forms of emergencies that we're facing now. In light of this emerging narrative, how is that emerging narrative going to interact with the pre-existing sense of disenchantment with the functioning of democracy and with democracy as an overall system? I think that's a very important question for us to reflect on. And the second question is, as we are heading into most likely a very significant phase of recession, which will be characterized most likely also by a drop in commodity prices, and we know that has been having a very significant impact on political dynamics. What should we expect? It is possible, it is probably likely that we'll witness even deeper fractures emerging in society as a result of this. And then the question is, how do we get ready for that? So these are just some of the insights that emerge from this research. I'm happy to share more or have a further conversation on this as people think might be useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel. If you can send the link in the chat, I think that would be useful for all of us. But now I want to quickly pass it to Francisco, Sandra, and Herman for the next round of interventions before we, the round of presentations before we open the space for a little bit more intervention. Francisco Alfaro, I want to pass it to you at this stage. To discuss, I guess, more of an academic perspective on challenges and opportunities for peace building in the region. Francisco, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see you too.
Okay. Well, I was asked to share the civil society perspective on the regional peace building in the Americas, talking about what are the key security trends with a specific focus on the situation on Venezuela and Colombia border, challenges and opportunities, as well to share how the United Nations can better support these efforts. I'm going to talk from the perspective of the Venezuelan conflict that represents a big challenge for the region in the conflict prevention, peace building, and democratic protection areas. Venezuela faces a humanitarian, multidimensional, and complex crisis as a result of a political conflict that has lasted for a long time and has not been able to transform. Between 2007 and 2015, the political system switched to electoral authoritarianism, and from 2015 and today, it passed to a hegemonic authoritarianism with a totalitarian vocation. This mutation was progressive and silent, and the inter-American system couldn't act timely and effectively. The consequences of this chronic conflict are not only local, but regional. What are the main causes of this conflict? Well, the clash of opposing political projects and the lack of understanding of the asymmetry of the conflict and lack of maturation in the parts. What are the main threats with this conflict? Well, first of all, the deinstitutionalization affects the possibility to manage any public policy and manage threats as the COVID-19 in a coordinated way and access to resources. The interest of foreign actors, the growing fragilization of the state, the worsening of the economic situation and the aggravation with the international sanctions, and the anti-politics tendency is increasing because their incapacity to manage the basic and urgent needs of the people. What are the main lessons learned until today? Well, we have had at least 5 alternative mechanisms of dialogue and negotiation. They have patterns, they have reduced the violence, but have failed to transform the conflict. That is very important, and maybe this is one of the main lessons learned. That mechanism could show us some topics and issues that are in the interest of both parts. And maybe one of the main lessons learned until this moment is that an electoral solution does not guarantee a solution to the conflict, not only an electoral solution. We have some strengths at this moment in Venezuela. The polarization loses ground, structural coexistence predominates. The majority of population wants a negotiated solution to the conflict. We have, until this moment, a worldwide attention, and a lot of groups of the civil society are articulating bridges of understanding. What are the main challenges at this moment? Well, the conflict transcended the legal frame. The re-institutionalization of the country is indispensable requirement. It is indispensable to determine the cost to return to alternation in the power. We need to recognize and enhance capabilities, properly map the strategic actors to deal in this conflict, and it's important to recognize that not all the groups of both coalitions in the conflict are represented in the alternative mechanism of dialogue and negotiation. It's very important to insist in the unity of the coalitions. Any solution needs to balance peace and justice. It's very important to promote a favorable public opinion that support the peaceful solution, because the cost of people that defend the peaceful solution in the social networks, for example, is very high at this moment. It's very important to achieve a common position between the different coalitions, because that is a problem sometimes. And there is a division around the legitimacy and the recognition of the multilateral organization in each actors. Some recommendation, well, it's very important to insist on negotiation. It's very important to alternate positive and negative incentives, design mechanisms that counteract confrontation, build sectorial and progressive agreement, not only to think in the big agreement. It's very important to go step by step, building sectorial and progressive agreements. We need to develop channels of communication that fit the negotiation table, and protect those who promote the peace and the democratic solution. Talking about the border with Colombia, well, the deinstitutionalization of Venezuela has favored chaos in relation between the two countries. The rupture of consular, diplomatic, and commercial relations between both countries has favored the presence and influence of irregular and violent groups. Migrating population in the area is vulnerable, poor, and can be easily recruited by irregular groups. The microphone diplomacy between capitals, Bogota and Caracas, increased the violence escalation and doesn't understand the reality in the borders. The influence of the United States on the leadership in Colombia is really high, and this is a factor a foreign factor that influence in the relation between actors. And of course, the weakness of the peace process and internal and foreign spoilers in Colombia, the peace process in Colombia. Talking about the Organization of American States and United Nations. Well, United Nations and the Organization of American States had an early participation in the mediation of the conflict in Venezuela between 2002 and 2004, promoting an electoral solution. Even this solution could decrease the violence at that moment, it couldn't transform the conflict in the mid and long term. An election is not enough to transform a conflict. The question is, how can the multilateral organization promote a more complex solution? That is a big challenge. The conflict has positioned us on one side and is not recognized by the other side or the other coalition. The United Nations seems to have a disaggregated performance among its agencies and commissioners inside Venezuela that at the moment hinders its role as a valid third party. Also, there are the dynamics of the Security Council. The dynamic of the Security Council into the United Nations have been influencing the escalation of the violence in Venezuela. That lack or the impossibility to achieve an agreement to give an order to the United Nations to act in Venezuela. The General Secretary could play a more important role, as well as the appointment of a mediator from his or its expert staff. There is an expert staff of mediators in United Nations that could help here in Venezuela. Third parties with credibility have been affected in their work. For example, European Union, the Vatican, Norway. However, they maintain some credibility and contacts with the coalitions. Both organizations, UN and OAS, are limited to participate by the recognition and requirement of the parts. And finally, for both organizations, there is the challenge about how to deal effectively with unusual local threats over the liberal democracy in a preventive and timely way. Thank you.
Thanks, Francisco. I'm going to now pass it to Sandra Guzman, who will tell us a little bit more specifically on the climate change situation and the impact of climate change on the conflict trends in the Americas. Sandra, I'll pass it to you now.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me well. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this interesting conversation. Yeah, I would like to start saying that definitely climate change is putting a lot of pressure in vital aspects of the social and economic life in Latin America when we talk about production of food, access to water, and other natural resources that are really important for the survival of the economies in our region. And of course, most of the impacts are always living in the smaller countries, but not only the small countries. We are talking about the impact that the climate change is having in emerging economies as well. And this is obviously putting a lot of pressure in security matters. So I would like to emphasize two specific examples that can show us how security matters in a context of climate change will increase in terms of the problems that we can face in the future years. So the first problem that I want to highlight, the first example, is the problem of migration. In the last couple of years, we have been experiencing this migration from Central America towards the US. And one of the key elements of these migrations have a climate change context. In the dry corridor, there has been a lot of droughts, like producing several effects in the production of food in the region in Central America. And this is definitely taking a lot of the production and the means of survival of plenty of families that now are basically looking for better places to live, better places to stay. And this is one of the reasons why they are leaving their homes to travel towards the US. What is happening that they are traveling through Mexico, and this is creating a lot of impact in the really weak stability of Mexico, for instance, and also is increasing other security issues. And this is interesting because when we talk about, if you see all the news about the migration from Central America, almost nobody talks about climate change, and the climate change being one of the problems that these families is seeing. So when we talk about migration in this context, we are talking about impacts for the people that immigrate, but also for the people that live in the country. In this case, plenty of the towns in Mexico started to face different problems in terms of insecurity, violence, but also we started to see a lot of problems with social discrimination. Of course, the people that immigrate, they do it because they don't have anything else to lose. I mean, they are just looking for better places to be. But this is creating a tension in the population, and of course, this is increasing the levels of vulnerability and the violence, and of course, uncertainty. Because what we have been experiencing in the case of Mexico is the limited capacity of the state to really control the process of migration, and also to provide like a solution. Plenty of families from Central America have established in Mexico now. And of course, this is leading towards another problem, which is the informal economy, increasing informal jobs, increasing informal activities. And in a way, we are just seeing what a really vicious cycle is going around. And all of this is in the context of climate change. So the second example that I want to highlight, and then I'm going to reflect on these two, you were talking about the case of Colombia. That is a case that I have been studying as well. Colombia, as you know, and as you have been saying, has been facing these insecurity issues because of the drug trafficking, which is the same case than in Mexico. And one of the things that has been really interesting is that, as you know, the production of cocaine has leading massive levels of deforestation in the country. And this, of course, is having impact in terms of the release of greenhouse gases emissions, but also the effects that these activities having in the biodiversity and in the more kind of the environmental perspective. One of the things that was really interesting is that during the government of Santos, in the context of the peace agreement, DMP and the environmental ministry tried to bring a climate change perspective into the peace agreement, to show that insecurity issues are also related to environmental issues. So we cannot divide social issues from environmental issues, and the security process tried to bring this climate change approach to say that we had to really, if we really want to have a peace agreement, it is important to have all of these different elements. The problem is that, as far as I know, with the arrival of Duque, this approach from the environmental perspective in the context of the peace agreement is not like highlighted recently. But one of the things that we are facing is precisely that countries are not necessarily connecting the different dots. They are not necessarily building these narratives where environmental and social issues are part of the same issues. Is something that we also saw in Chile in the manifestation last year, and in many countries where countries or governments are very willing to deal with social problems, but they don't care about environmental issues, which at the end of the day are really is the base of many of the social problems. So one of the things that I think is creating a lot of tension in order to achieve peace in the region is that all of these problems are part of the same, let's say, picture, and we are not connecting the dots. So for me, it's a matter of it's a cycle problem. Major climate impact will create major social effects and problems, and this will affect the vulnerable institutional arrangements that we have in the region. And at the same time, this will create uncertainty. This will create economic impact. And as you saw in many countries, the revenues that we have to really invest in social and environmental projects are becoming very limited and scarce. And without mentioning that plenty of the revenues that we have in the Latin American countries come from oil and extractive activities. So we also have to start decoupling our economy from these extractive activities, to start thinking in how we are going to diversify the economy. But one of the things that I think is also very important to take into account is that when countries stop having enough national resources to face these problems, they started to ask for more money internationally. So what we are facing now is that the international support is putting a lot of pressure in the economy, is increasing the external debt. And coronavirus is a very interesting example, because what now we are facing, that our national health sectors are not necessarily ready for this type of pandemic. And now the International Monetary Fund is preparing their loans for these countries in order to help them out with this situation. And of course, this is not a grant. This is not for charity. This is a thing that will have a big impact in the financial system of our countries. So I think that when we talk about peace, we also have to talk about the whole financial architecture and how we are going to build peace if our economies are definitely in a very deep problematic situation where there is not necessarily a collaboration between the different sectors. So I would like to say that what we have now in the context of coronavirus is a very good opportunity to redefine this process of economic recovery. Has to be different. We cannot go back to the business as usual. We have to think in a new way of development. We have to think in a new way of well-being, where most of the people have to be considered. And it's a very good opportunity to think in this cycle, different pieces of the coin, because we cannot just face peace without thinking in environment. We cannot have peace without thinking in social well-being, and we cannot think in peace in a context of climate change, because this will increase all the different problems that we are facing are going to extrapolate in the next few years and decades. So I definitely would love to hear more about how to push this economic recovery towards one that is, of course, more sustainable, but particularly cares about well-being of the population, and not only about some specific sectors that are always the ones that kind of have the rich ones, let's say. So thank you so much. And just with this few comments, I'm so sorry that I have to jump out in a few minutes, but I'm gonna be very, very happy to keep touching base with you guys to discuss all of these issues that we are facing in this space. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandra. We will also post that video so you can see how the conversation will evolve in the group chat that we are organizing next week. So now I want to pass it to Herman Rosa Chavez to speak on the El Salvador peace process and the, I guess, the implications of climate change in that conflict. Herman, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I would like to share my screen, if I may.
Sure.
Okay, can you?
Yes, it works, yes.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about El Salvador. I think El Salvador is an interesting case because it's like it's lab-sized. It's the smallest country in the Americas, and I think provide us a window to look at some of these issues. On peace building, we have to remember that the 1992 peace accords were mediated by the UN, and was the first time the UN mediated in an internal conflict and oversaw compliance. So in that sense, it was groundbreaking for the UN. The peace accords successfully advanced far-reaching political reforms, but sidelined social and economic reforms that could have sustained peace. Instead, radical neoliberal reforms were pushed by the government with the support of the Bretton Woods institutions. And these planted the seeds for problems to come, including high levels of social violence. Political violence did cease after the peace accords. But in turn, what we had is high levels of criminal violence and El Salvador became, and still is, the country with the highest homicide rate in the world. Migration has been the favored option. We now have about 2.5 million people of Salvadorian origin living in the United States and 6.4 million living in El Salvador. Population growth has been arrested in contrast with the rest of Central America, where population continues to grow. And remittances now represent more than 20% of GDP, and also more than 20% of households are recipients of remittances. Remittances drive the economy and the dynamics of poverty and inequality. Electoral democracy is most definitely losing legitimacy, as Emmanuel mentioned, and because it's failed to address the country's most fundamental problems. And something that we thought was unthinkable for El Salvador, the return to authoritarian rule, is actually becoming a real possibility. On climate change, the key issue is the climate variability. Climate change is already having significant impacts. There is an increased frequency of extreme precipitation events. We had one each in 1960s and 1970s, but we have 9 in the decade between 2002 and 2011. 3 extreme precipitation events during the 3 years from 2009 to 2011 caused economic loss and damage equivalent to 6% of GDP. A stronger dry period or canicula during the rainy season is causing great losses in fruit crops. This is something that Sandra already highlighted. Extreme precipitation and drought most definitely are fueling migration. Indeed, a study using data from Salvadoran rural households showed that the probability of a household sending members abroad decreased by 24% in the absence of adverse shocks. So we do have climate migrants already. And the state has lost capacity to implement disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures. Climate-related disaster divert resources for emergency response, and reconstruction focuses on rebuilding what has been lost rather than creating new stocks of capital. With an increasingly limited fiscal space due to increasing debt and other reasons, short-term policies come to the forefront, pushing to the back burner the implementation of resilience building policies. So, ¿qué hacer? What is to be done? And here I think the key elements is that we need to close the implementation gap, because we know what to do. But the political will at the highest level of government is missing, as well as the financial means for implementation. And here I think a concerted effort of the international community can be absolutely key. And if it's the World Bank, the IMF, are absolutely key. They have much greater influence of a government action than any other official actors. But their frameworks are still limited. They're moving, but far too slowly, and they urgently need to expand their frameworks. Climate finance is essential, but the Green Climate Fund project format is cumbersome and does little to advance change. Policy or results-based funding could be far more effective in this regard. Bilateral donors can be highly influential in small countries like El Salvador and should support change by seriously engaging government and civil society. We have to recognize that UN regional institutions have lost muscle and influence. But we have seen today, strategic thinking is still alive and should inform institutional reinvention for a post-COVID-19 world. As Sandra said, there is no way we can go back to business as usual. And I think this provides a tremendous opportunity for rethinking, for reinvention. And finally, stronger North-South linkages between policy research-oriented communities, I think, can raise awareness, can raise momentum for change at the national and international spheres. And I think I'll stay there, here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hernan. We really appreciate your intervention. And I guess as we round up a little discussion on the climate change, I would want to open the discussion for a few short interventions. I know that UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Colombia was interested to speak and offer a short intervention. Can you unmute?
Okay, hi. This is Pontus from the Resident Coordinator Office. And thanks so much for a very interesting set of reflections. And I just wanted to sort of, a few points from the last 4 or 5 years of working in Colombia and echo and you know, echo some of the points that I think are very important. The first one, it's very clear the way we are bringing in and linking the peace building and the sustaining peace and development and the development lens. This is something that, in fact, Colombia has been working on even throughout the years of the conflict. The first linked up, you know, sort of development and peace building program that I was part of developing in Colombia was some 15 years ago in the midst of the conflict. Our last UNDAF, which just ended, about 2/3 of our investment, our development investment, was focused on a peace building pillar in a comprehensive fashion. Both included support to the implementing of the peace agreement, but much more around transforming conflicts and risks out in the regions, building or supporting local governments' participation in human rights institutions, and also attending and assisting the victims of the conflict and in the process of reparation. So this was even in the UNDAF that we put together before the signing of the peace agreement. And we've just on Thursday, before we went into full lockdown for coronavirus, signed our new Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, where about 1/3 of our investment now is on support to the peace implementation. And the other third, about 2/3 of it, is now with the migration response to Venezuela. Another issue that was brought out as a critical to being able to prevent and manage the sort of tensions that we see could arise and generate new dynamics of conflict and violence in Colombia. All of this is linked with the SDGs. When we look at the Colombian peace agreement, the peace agreement is largely a development solution to a conflict. It's a conflict that was based on exclusion throughout many years, economic exclusion. It's not a primarily political conflict, or it's not a primarily identity conflict. It was a sort of an economic exclusion conflict fueled by illicit economies, and therefore the answer and the solutions that being put forth from Colombia was very much this development solution. And I just want to do sort of one quick reflection on sort of the things that have changed and haven't changed in the government side, from the Santos government to the current government. because on the one hand, we see a shift, and it's even there's a political, in a way that the current government came in on the political opposition to the agreement as such. But having said that, in fact, we see a lot of common agreement and continuation, particularly around those elements of the peace agreement that tries to strengthen, accelerate investment in those areas, the marginal, remote areas that were most affected by the conflict. And I just want to sort of highlight this, because I think this, what we're seeing is a dialogue among the different political elites and the different position among the political elites in Colombia, the different strands, the different angles to it. But there are certain common elements that underlie the understanding. That is that for Colombia to progress, the development investments and the development needs to be much more equally distributed across the territory. And we do need to deal with some of the elements of the illicit armed conflicts and provide licit and good development options for the population in the country if this is supposed to proceed. So in a way, it's a more optimistic note that exactly this reflections around participation and democracy is what's going to take it forward. So that's my first reflection. We'll have to see what coronavirus situation does to that. It's still too early to say. The second thing to say is that one of the key elements has been the cohesion around the international community in support of this transformation. It's part of the peace agreement in the last few years, but the transformation and even beyond that, sort of to reach a negotiated solution to a big chunk of the armed conflict, and that involved the UN, the OAS, the European donors, countries, and the Americans. And in fact, it's quite striking that while we have a lot of differences in the council and so forth around Venezuela situation, it's very polarizing. Around Colombia, there still seemed to be a good cohesion and coherence in the international community, both at the global level and here in country. And that has been very important, at least speaking now from here in country, to drive through a good support for that peace implementation effort, both on the political level, but also on the practical level. One thing that was mentioned is how we divided up with the UN system, the work between the mission and the verification mission and the agency's funds and programs. And I think that that's actually a very, very useful and good example from the UN system of how we need to bring the peace architectures together. Sometimes we say we are the most integrated, non-integrated mission in the world. I don't know if we can really compare that, but we actually work very aligned, very coordinated, with very clear responsibilities that complement each other, although we are technically a non-integrated mission. And we also have a very strong contact with OAS and the peace mission of the OAS that has verified previous agreements and continue to do observation and verification in the country. And I think that's also has been a strength that we can play to the different strengths of the multilateral bodies when we need different types of political neutrality or closeness to the countries and the issues that we deal with. Right. Third thing, financial mechanism has been critical for us to increase funding for peace. We've established a pooled fund that channels all of the peace building funding to the country that has worked very well, that has scaled up to approximately $150–160 million investment in sort of traditional investment in peace building. And what we're doing now, what we did in the new government is that we renew that financial architecture for the country, and we call it now Fund for Sustaining Peace. But in fact, we have a lot of continuation of the investments that we're doing, which are these on-the-ground development investments in the most affected regions. And we're moving to pilot blended finance through this element. I think that's also a very important element. We did that with the Peacebuilding Fund. That is to use some of our grant resources for peace building to actually get private sector investment with peace impact, with social impact on the peace in those regions that were most affected by the conflict. In fact, with $2 million from the Peacebuilding Fund, we have leveraged some $15 million of private sector investment in those regions that were most affected by the conflict, and we think we can scale that up. So I think that's, someone mentioned the financial mechanism. I think that's something that we really need to think of, a good architecture, but also think of how we use the resources to leverage bigger social impact investment in private sector flows. Last two, very quick, I'm not going to extend myself. On an environmental side and the deforestation, in fact, what we've seen, and that's a little bit worrying, is that some elements of environmental impact, such as deforestation, have increased following the peace agreement. Areas that were previously off the radar for economic interventions, are now within that grasp. We don't see deforestation primarily driven by cultivation. That is one of the elements, but we see more in terms of a land grab, trying to move in with cattle and so forth, bigger economic interest that eventually is sort of a land speculation drive. And I think that's something that we're trying to tackle, or the country is trying to tackle as part of that, the economic solutions in these remote areas. They're not going to be heavily intensive agricultural development necessarily. We need to find green solutions, environmental solutions to generate sustainable livelihoods in these areas. And the last reflection, which was brought up, and I think is very, very important, is the Venezuelan border. And this is where, in fact, the issue kind of slips out of our hands. We are trying to deal now with a very large influx of migrants and refugees, but the actual lack of dialogue and political dialogue across the countries, I guess also to generate a transformation in Venezuela, with the announcement this morning from the US, I guess that would make it even harder. And is generating, I think, a whole new instability factor for not just for Colombia, for the region. And I think we need to start looking at that border region and both sides of that border region in a way as a new emerging conflict system that needs to be tackled. And I think this idea of maintaining some sort of spaces for dialogue and channels of communications around that is critical, but I don't really see how that is happening, or very difficult to see how that can really flourish at this current context. So reflection from Colombia. Sorry if I extended myself.
Thank you, Pontus. I just want to really briefly pass it to Adriana from Igarape Institute for a quick comment before we pass it to the last speaker. Adriana?
Thank you very much. I wanted to make a very quick comment that is very related to the last one, and has to do with deforestation in the Amazon. As you know, there has been a peak in invasions of land, especially protected indigenous land, forest fires, and also there is an explosion in illegal gold mining, not just in Brazil, but other parts of the Amazon. And this is bound to increase this year, by the way, due to the increase in price of gold. So in Brazil, what's happening is that for the first time, an issue that has been historically viewed as a development question, and there's a strong assumption that these activities are driven by individuals and small groups of poor citizens looking for survival strategies. There's now a growing realization that organized crime, and here we're talking about criminal networks that specialize in environmental crimes, are driving this in very systematic ways. They count on very good financing, sometimes from within the region, sometimes from big cities like São Paulo and Curitiba in Brazil. All of these have highly local impacts, but they are driven by transnational dimensions and phenomena. And so on the one hand, you have here in Brazil, not exclusively in Brazil, a government that seeks to open up all of this land for mining and land uses for ranching and soybean farming. But on the other hand, I think you have an unprecedented attempt by civil society and some private actors and some subnational governments to coordinate action and find solutions. So there are some sources of hope. Again, they don't substitute having a coherent, evidence-based state approach, but we're hoping that this will curb not only deforestation, but crime and violence. At the Igarapé, we are doing research on this for the next 5 years. And what we find is that wherever you have a hotspot of land invasions, of illegal mining, of logging, you also have crimes that span the range from petty crimes to assassinations to drug, arms trafficking, human trafficking, and many others. So it's very important that regional organizations and the UN help to promote the understanding that the Amazon is also a security issue, and that collaboration at all levels is required in order to promote beautiful drawings, but also peace building in the Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Before we open the floor for the last round of interventions, I really wanted to pass it to Andre Serbin-Pont, who is the coordinator for GPPAC network in Latin America, as well as director of CRIES. Andre, passing it on to you to share, I guess, your broader regional perspective of what local peace builders are doing in the region to tackle some of the challenges, and how regional and international multilateral partners can support you in this work.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. We've had a lot of great content already, so I think thank you to the other speakers that have been participating, as well as the great discussion section. That chat was on fire. That was really good. So I hope everybody's staying safe. I'm going to talk a bit from our GPPAC perspective and the work that we've been doing in Latin America for the last 15 years or so. But of course, I won't talk about 15 full-on years, mostly some of the most recent initiatives that we had and some of the challenges that we're facing, right? So GPPAC has been in Latin America and the Caribbean for about 15 years now. Last 4 years, we've been implementing our regional responses program that was originally born out of the need to provide the regional actions to contain the impact of Venezuela's crisis in Latin America. It wasn't that this crisis was only priority because of its dimensions, but it was also useful to point out the existing vulnerabilities in the region that were not necessarily being tackled or were not being given proper attention. In part, these vulnerabilities were linked to the reduced state capacities to provide essential services to large, vulnerable, displaced populations, which has become quite obvious when we look at the case of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and actually many others, and most of the regions or most of the countries that are becoming recipients of Venezuelan refugees. As we're working on these issues, which we do based on a large network of civil society organizations and academics from across all of Latin America and the Caribbean, we noticed many recurring patterns as well as shared challenges and experiences. A good example has been Nicaragua, that internally is seeing very similar patterns of repression of civil society as in Venezuela. And in external terms, it's also seeing a large outflow of vulnerable populations and political dissidents as well as professionals, which creates tensions both on its borders and the countries that are surrounding it, as well as reducing Nicaragua's own capacity to deal with future challenges. So it seems like it's kind of emulating the same problems as that we're seeing in Venezuela, that we have been seeing in Venezuela for some time now. We can go deeper into many of these challenges, and I want to keep it short. We don't have enough time for that, but I will point out 2 elements that have helped out bringing attention to underlying structural issues in the region that we're trying to tackle. 2 of them actually have already been mentioned quite a bit, and I think it's important to make sure we keep them highlighted. One is the wave of protests that we saw last year, and now the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. As both are highlighting the importance of social inequality, the crisis representation, and the limitations of state in understanding the volatility of the region. We look at Chile in 2019 as a good example of this. While many consider it to be one of the best performing and most stable economies in the region in recent years, it faced widespread protests across the country. In large part, these were because of underlying inequality, social inequality. Although the indicators were growing and improving over the last few years, it wasn't going at the pace that most of civil society expected. And it also represented this crisis in representation in which the political leadership was challenged by its incapability to properly channel and respond to citizen demands. Right now, as we are speaking, I'm in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where the government is faced with two large challenges. There's the limited capacity to respond to the pandemic, and even more limitations to respond to pre-existing and growing socioeconomic crisis that seems to overshadow what happened already in the 2001 collapse. The elements of the second crisis can be traced back to decades of ineffective and social and economic policies that now, with the arrival of COVID-19, is creating conditions for like this perfect storm, just to use a cliche metaphor. So what do we do? Well, in CRIES GPPAC, we work on strengthening our civil society discussion spaces and ensure that these spaces lead to the production of publications and policy briefs and insights that we can use to engage with decision makers. So far, we've been successful as governments are proactively asking us to participate as observers in the events, asking for our briefs, coming to us to provide them with experts on specific issues, and also participating in discussions as they see that the discussions and the dynamics contribute to creating a safe space in which they can obtain valuable information, analysis, and recommendations. We are also pursuing this format in engaging with multilateral organizations. We have received representatives from the OAS, as well as have engaged with different UN offices and hope to continue doing so. This is where we want to continue strengthening our capacities right now, especially in this current context of the COVID crisis, because we do believe that that what's coming ahead of us is a large questioning or criticism of the multilateral system. And I think a lot of national governments are already pointing their fingers at multilateral organizations and criticizing them and trying to gather more nationalist looking inward support. And this is the exact moment in which multilateral initiatives have to take strength, have to be highlighted and utilized to deal with this growing pandemic. One last issue, and it's not a minor one, is that in this current global economic crisis, and I think some of the speakers touched upon this to a certain extent, it's going to take a large toll on civil society organizations across Latin America and the Caribbean. Many of the CSOs in the region depend strongly on foundations or foreign cooperation, and we can expect a lot of this funding to likely be cut or reduced drastically. And there's already a lot of CSO organizations that are in very vulnerable financial conditions. So one thing that we're trying to emphasize in our work is how do we support these organizations that are now even more vulnerable to this financial crisis that is upcoming, to ensure that this doesn't create the perfect opportunity for governments that have more authoritarian tendencies to utilize this reduction in financial support for civil society organizations and try to advance and reduce even more the civic spaces in our region. And as a last thought, because I've heard like several things that in the discussion and as well as in the interactions with the other speakers and the questions, I think that some key elements that we have to keep in mind is with the COVID crisis, the issue of militarization and the utilization of state tools to further increase the capacity of governments to outreach and sometimes even erode democracy. I really like that we had the discussion on illegal mining and deforestation. I think that I usually try to emphasize the Venezuelan aspect of this because right now we have one of the largest environmental crises in the region. It's going on in the Arco Minero in Venezuela. And it's not just the combination of inexistence of environmental policy and complete exploitation with no regard for the environment. It's also combined with systematic human rights violations, the increase of parastate organizations, and the growth of armed conflict between these parastate organizations. I like the idea of, we've been emphasizing a lot the issue of social regional instability. In the discussion with some of the members, we were talking about the issue that, when you talk about a 2-week quarantine in a region where usually the average in the country, around 50% of the labor force is hired informally and they work for a day-to-day paycheck, telling them that they have to stay home for 2 weeks and buy enough food for 2 weeks is out of the question. So this pandemic is really bringing out a lot of the key vulnerabilities that states in the region have. And then we're going to have to see what the cost of the pandemic are going to be. And then not just in the terms that I'm mentioning right now and paralyzing the economy, but also we've seen an absolute collapse in the commodities. And in Latin America, collapses of the commodities have really harsh consequences, and it's going to further erode the capacities of states to adequately respond. I'm sorry, I spoke a lot and really fast, but I wanted to make sure to get everything in there.
Thanks so much, Andre, and we were taking a lot of notes. So with that in mind, I wanted to open the floor for the last round of intervention to reflect, I guess, on what Andre has started to kick us off is with what are some of the roles and some of the greater roles that different actors within the region can take to support local needs and local work with civil society. I do not know, Luis, you from International IDEA, you wanted to jump in earlier. I'm not sure you are still on the call. Seeing none, maybe Yadira from Organization of American States? I can unmute you, Yadira. No, I can't. Yadira, can you hear us? Hello? I'm not sure I'm hearing the silence. Is that just me or we have an issue with microphone?
Marina, just to say that Yadira has mic problems, but you can move ahead and she can speak next.
I couldn't hear from anyone. That's why I was not sure if we are still going on or and I cannot hear anyone. Luis, do you also have issues with your microphone?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think next time, and I remember, Luis, you had the same problem last time, and Yadira the same. And the best way to do so to speak would be for you to actually call in, because that's how we can actually hear you.
Thanks, Christina. Well, I guess if Luis or Yadira can either call in or leave their message in the chat box, that would be great. In the meantime, I wanted to open a space for anyone else who wanted to make an intervention. Catalina?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to add, I'm Catalina Perdomo, I'm DPDA in the Resident Coordinator's Office in Colombia. And I just wanted to add something to the intervention made by Pontus Hörstedt. Basically, an additional issue that was also presented in your introduction was the need to have a more bottom-up approach to peace building. And I think in this case, we're doing an extremely interesting exercise here in Colombia, where basically we are working together with the government to understand how the PDETs, that basically they are called the programs or the programas de desarrollo con enfoque territorial. Sorry, I have my kids here. Also, schools are closed here. So basically, we are looking at how we can support those PDETs with our new cooperation framework and integrating that bottom-up planning into the UN cooperation framework. So this is switching the way the UN is supporting peace from from looking at to the government, that is what we traditionally do, the government request, and then implementing in the territories, to basically listening what the territories want from their side in terms of development to build in peace, so that we can support in our cooperation. That's all from my side. Yes.
Marina, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
That's all from my side. Yeah.
Oh, so I was mute. Yes, sorry. Is anyone else interested to come in at this stage?
Hello.
Yes.
Me, Cristina, I want to intervene. Yes, very interesting presentations, and the topic is very, very important for the region. One thing, we are working with IGARAPE maybe 1 year ago about these topics about climate change and security and the impact on peace building in the region. I'm from Colombia, but I live in Canada, and in this moment with the corona crisis, like Andre and some of you have mentioned, you begin to see the impact of climate change, and it's not very aware the relation between climate change and the emergence of these kind of diseases that have been identified for many multilateral organizations and scientific groups. And this is the moment to talk about the role of Latin America and a region with many resources, with a rainforest that is important to tackle global warming, and how at the same time the link between inequality, violence, like Adriana mentioned before, and how these three variables, climate change, inequality, and violence are together in the context of Latin America. For instance, the role of illegal crops in Colombia and in some neighboring countries, but particularly in the case of Colombia, to destroy the rainforest. And this is a long tradition in the context of Colombia because they fuel, give money to the illegal groups. And it's important that the multilateral organizations and the national governments begin to talk about the legalization of this kind of illegal subproducts of like cocaine or heroin. And I think it's a debate to put on the table that is very critical, is sensitive, but it's important to try to reduce violence, at least in the case of Colombia, the destruction of the rainforest, and at the same time to act in the case of the mitigation of the global warming. That's it for me.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we're well ahead of the planned time. We were initially planning to make that call for an hour and then for another 30 minutes. And that, I guess, speaks to the need of having and continuing these discussions. And that's why we would like to invite you to participate in our forum, which will kick off on Monday and continue those discussions. The video from this webinar will be posted there, and will basically support the discussion moving forward and continue to fuel the dialogue before we make, I guess, final determination on the possible Colombia consultation that we all as a team were planning. But before we close the meeting, I just wanted to pass into our speakers for any closing remarks, reflections. I know some of you may already moved on, but Chelsea, Mirna, Emmanuel, would you like to offer some closing remarks? Herman, Andre? Chelsea, maybe we can start with you.
No, nothing more from me. I'm conscious we're well over time, but thank you, colleagues, for a very rich discussion. I've been following the chat as well, and it's really interesting to see. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Chelsea. Mirna?
Thank everybody. It was a good discussion. Have a good weekend.
Emmanuel, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think that Emmanuel is disconnected.
Yeah, I think he's gone. Herman, are you still with us?
Okay. No, I think just we have to remember, no, our current multilateral system emerged after the Second World War. I think the COVID-19 is a new situation, very much similar to that in terms of their reach. And I think there is an opportunity, and we have to think about what will emerge in terms of institutional arrangement, or what should emerge after this crisis. And I think the UN system in particular, I think has a huge challenge in that regard. No? But I think I've seen that strategic thinking is still very much alive within the system. No? And that should drive the rethinking of the whole system to address the new world that will emerge. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. I guess Andre had also leave us. Well, thank you so much again for everyone who has joined us today. It was our pleasure to hear all of those reflections. And of course, as I mentioned, we will continue the discussion. I just posted a link to the group where the discussion will continue in the chat box for everyone. So please make sure to continue sharing your feedback, your resources, so we can make sure that it fits into relevant processes, and this conversation does not just stay beyond the conversation and goes forward with all of us being present and working together. Thank you so much, and we'll have another webinar next week focusing on sustainable development. So we'll hope you will be able to join us then and before that in the group. Thank you, and bye-bye everyone.